I had always thought of my family as a picture of harmony. My spouse and I, despite the occasional tension, had built something solid together. Our stepson, Jamie, was a product of my spouse's previous relationship, but we had found a way to coexist peacefully. I tried to love him as my own, though it was often complicated. The dynamics of being a step-parent were far from simple. There were times when Jamie and I would clash, but I would remind myself that it was just a phase, a teenager pushing against boundaries. My spouse and I, although deeply connected in some ways, had begun to drift apart. We no longer shared the intimacy or the excitement that had once defined our relationship. The spark had dulled over time, replaced by routine. I still loved them, but our marriage felt like it was running on autopilot. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Jamie, on the other hand, was growing into a young adult. His presence in the house was marked by sporadic outbursts and moments of introspection. Most of the time, he kept to himself, retreating into his room or out with friends. I had always respected Jamie's space, understanding that teenagers had their own world to navigate. Yet, there were moments when his behavior seemed off. It wasn't anything glaring, just subtle shifts in his mood, his sudden need for privacy, and the secretive glances he would cast when I walked into the room. I told myself it was normal, that adolescence had its ups and downs. After all, I had been through it myself. But even as I reassured myself, there were flashes of concern. He seemed more withdrawn, even for my spouse, and I couldn't help but notice the strange little details. Late nights with his phone, hurried whispers when he thought no one was listening. I could tell he was hiding something, but what? I wanted to ignore it, chalk it up to teenage rebellion, but the nagging feeling stayed with me. My spouse seemed oblivious, too consumed by their own work and life struggles to notice the subtle changes in Jamie. They would brush off my concerns with a smile, telling me that it was just a phase, just growing pains. But I wasn't sure anymore. It wasn't just normal teenage behavior. It felt like something deeper, something more troubling. I didn't want to overreact, but I couldn't help but feel that my instincts were telling me something wasn't right. The house was becoming a place of quiet tension. My spouse and I would share glances during dinner, the silence growing louder each time we tried to make small talk. Jamie's aloofness didn't help. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, though I didn't know what. There were nights when I would lay awake, listening to the house settle, and I couldn't stop my mind from racing. Was I imagining things, or was there something truly wrong? The thought kept me up far longer than I cared to admit. I wanted to believe it was nothing. I wanted to reassure myself that everything was fine. After all, I had always been the logical one, the one who could keep my emotions in check. But the uncertainty gnawed at me. I wasn't sure whether it was my role as a step-parent that made me feel distant, or if there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. The closer I tried to get to Jamie, the more he pulled away. I began to question myself. Was I just being paranoid? Was I misreading the signs? But deep down, a gut feeling told me that I wasn't. Something was going on, and I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I had to figure out what was really happening, even if it meant confronting something that could change everything. But how would I even begin to approach Jamie, or my spouse, with my suspicions? Would they think I was overstepping, trying to impose my role as a parent too much? The more I thought about it, the more complicated it became. The last thing I wanted was to stir up trouble, to create a rift in a family that had already endured so much. But could I really sit back and do nothing? Could I really ignore the signs that seemed to be growing more and more impossible to overlook? These questions weighed heavily on me as the days passed, each one feeling longer than the last. The once easy and peaceful moments in our home were now tinged with doubt. I had been living in a family of my own making, yet I felt increasingly like an outsider. My connection with Jamie, once small but meaningful, seemed to slip further out of my reach. The strain was becoming too much to ignore. It wasn't just about my relationship with my spouse anymore. It was about something far more personal, something that had been hidden beneath the surface, and I was beginning to wonder if it was something I had been blind to all along. I tried to dismiss the thoughts racing through my mind, but they were becoming impossible to ignore. The signs were all there, small but unmistakable. Jamie had become more secretive in the last few weeks, and my suspicions were growing. It wasn't just his mood swings anymore or his tendency to lock his door. It was the way he was acting, distant, distracted, almost like he had something to hide. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and I knew I had to confront it, even if I wasn't sure what it was I was dealing with. One afternoon, as I was cleaning the house, I found something that made my heart stop. It was a small, folded-up piece of paper wedged in the corner of the kitchen counter. I picked it up and unfolded it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was a note from someone named Emma. The note was simple. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Same time as last week. XOXO." My stomach dropped. I had no idea who Emma was, but it was clear that this wasn't a harmless note. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Was this some kind of prank, or was there something more going on? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but my instincts told me this was important. I knew I couldn't just sit on this. I had to find out what was happening, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about Jamie's life. Had he been seeing someone behind our backs? Was he hiding a relationship from us? The idea felt almost impossible, but the evidence was right there in my hands. I decided to confront him. I couldn't ignore this any longer, and I didn't know how else to handle it. I waited until the evening when the house was quiet, when my spouse was in the other room. I stood in front of Jamie's door, the note clutched tightly in my hand. My heart pounded in my chest as I knocked. Jamie opened the door, his face blank, but his eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. His gaze shifted downward when I held up the note. There was no denying what I had found. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the hesitation. For a brief moment, I thought he might deny everything, try to brush it off, but he didn't. Instead, he looked at me, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and shame. I felt my pulse quicken as I waited for him to speak. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. His hands were fidgeting nervously at his sides. I didn't respond right away. I just stared at him, waiting for an explanation. My mind was racing. How had it come to this? How had I allowed myself to be blind to the truth for so long? My own stepchild, the one I had tried so hard to bond with, was now the source of all this confusion. The anger began to rise within me, but I swallowed it down. I couldn't let. The air between us felt thick with tension. Jamie stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes full of regret. I wasn't sure how to proceed. Anger still bubbled beneath the surface, but there was a deeper, more painful emotion lurking within me: betrayal. I had tried so hard to be a good step-parent, to be understanding, to be a source of stability in his life. And now everything I had believed was being torn apart. I knew this wasn't just about Jamie anymore. It was about me, my marriage, and how I had let myself be blind to the cracks forming in the foundation of our family. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I had so many questions, so many things I needed to say, but my mind was scattered. I turned away, needing a moment to collect myself. I didn't want to yell or lash out, but the words were so close to the surface, just waiting to spill out. I had to confront this, but I didn't know how to do it without causing more damage. "Do you understand what you've done?" I asked, my voice quieter now, more controlled than I had expected. "Do you realize how much trust you've broken, not just with me, but with your mother?" Jamie's face twisted with guilt. He nodded, but there was no real answer. The silence between us grew unbearable. I could see how torn he was, how deeply conflicted he felt. But it didn't change the fact that he had lied, that he had deceived us. This wasn't just a simple mistake. This was a betrayal of everything we had tried to build together as a family. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Jamie said, his voice cracking. I didn't know how to deal with it. I thought I could keep it secret and it would just go away. But it didn't. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself. I had to stay calm. Losing control wasn't going to help anyone, especially not Jamie. But the truth was, I felt lost. I didn't know how to fix this. How could I even begin to rebuild trust after something like this? Could I forgive him? Could I forgive myself for not seeing the signs sooner? The anger I had been holding in started to leak out, and I couldn't stop it. You think you can just hide it and make it go away? Do you think that's how this works? You've betrayed your mother, you've betrayed me, and you think you can just sweep it under the rug? Jamie's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability that had been buried beneath his bravado. I never meant for this to happen, he whispered. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could handle it on my own. I could feel my frustration building again, but I forced myself to take a step back. This wasn't about me. This wasn't just about my anger. Jamie needed to understand the gravity of his actions, but he also needed to know that I wasn't giving up on him.
Not yet.
I don't know if I can forgive you right now, I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. You've hurt us in ways you don't even fully understand yet. But you have to face what you've done. You have to take responsibility for it. He nodded, tears now streaming down his face. I know I messed up. I don't know how to fix it. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The weight of his confession hung in the air, and I realized that this wasn't something we could just fix in one conversation. It was going to take time to process, to heal, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. And that was the hardest part. It wasn't just about Jamie, it was about all of us. How did we move forward from here? What did the future look like when everything we thought was solid had crumbled? I don't know what the next step is, I said finally, my voice hoarse. But I know that you have to be honest with your mom. She deserves to know the truth, Jamie. She deserves to know everything. I will, he said quickly. I'll tell her. I promise. I didn't believe him. Not fully. I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Telling my spouse, his mother, wasn't going to be a clean, straightforward conversation. It was going to destroy her. She loved him. She trusted him. And now, that trust had been broken in the most painful way possible. But as much as I hated the idea of confronting her with this, I knew it was necessary. She deserved the truth. And so did Jamie. The lie had already festered for too long, and now it was time for it to come to light. There was no turning back from this. I'll help you, but you have to do the right thing, I said, looking him in the eye. This is your mess now, Jamie. You have to own it. You can't run from it anymore. He nodded, his face a mixture of shame and determination. I'll do it. I'll tell her. I didn't know if he could. I didn't know if any of us were ready for what would come next. But we had no choice. The truth was out, and now we all had to face it. As I turned away, I felt the weight of the situation bearing down on me. Nothing was going to be the same again. The foundation of our family had been shattered, and now we had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. Would we ever be whole again? Would Jamie and my spouse be able to rebuild the relationship they had? Would I? Only time would tell. But for now, all I could do was brace myself for the storm that was coming, and hope we would find a way to weather it together. The aftermath of the confrontation left a heavy silence in the house. Jamie had promised to tell his mother the truth, but I wasn't sure whether he would follow through. The tension between us was unbearable. Every time I walked past his room, I saw the lingering guilt in his eyes. He had been avoiding me, which only made things worse. I didn't know how to move forward, and neither did he. The weight of the lie hung between us, like an impenetrable wall. But I knew we couldn't stay like this forever. I had to prepare myself for the inevitable conversation with my spouse. I wasn't sure how they would react when they found out. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, anger, tears, disbelief. I knew this would destroy them. They had always trusted Jamie, loved him as their own, and now everything was shattered. I didn't want to be the one to tell them, but it was the right thing to do. They needed to know the truth. They deserved to know. As the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. Even if Jamie came clean, even if he begged for forgiveness, the damage was done. I had seen the cracks in our relationship long before this, but now they were wide and deep. How could we ever move past this? How could I look at my spouse the same way again after everything that had happened? When my spouse finally came home that evening, I knew it was time. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. I wanted to delay it, to keep the peace for just a little longer, but I knew that wasn't possible. I couldn't protect them from this. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine when it was falling apart. "Do you need to talk?" they asked, looking at me with a weary expression. I could tell they sensed something was wrong, but they didn't know the extent of it. I didn't answer right away. The words felt like they were stuck in my throat. How could I explain something so painful? How could I make them understand the depth of the betrayal? My mind raced, trying to find the right words, but there was no way to sugarcoat this. "I have something to tell you," I finally said, my voice shaky. "It's about Jamie." Their face immediately shifted, concern flashing in their eyes. "What's wrong? Is he okay?"